A 7-year-old billionaire's son was called mute, but the truth was far more heartbreaking than anyone could imagine. Every famous doctor said nothing could help him. Then a new housekeeper noticed one tiny detail everyone else had ignored, and within hours, this little boy spoke his very first word. This emotional story isn't just about a miracle. It's about how one ordinary woman uncovered a life-changing truth that millions of dollars couldn't buy. Don't skip this story, because the ending will remind you that sometimes the person who saves a life is the one nobody thought was worth listening to. For 7 years, everyone believed the little boy had chosen silence. The world's finest doctors had examined him. Specialists with walls covered in awards had written report after report, each one sounding more certain than the last. His billionaire father spent millions chasing answers, convinced that somewhere, someone would finally unlock the mystery. No one ever did, until the day a woman no one considered important quietly walked through the front door. Her name was Claire Sullivan. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a therapist. She didn't carry impressive titles or expensive degrees. She carried something far rarer. She knew what it looked like when pain had been misunderstood. Claire arrived at the sprawling Ashford estate on a cold Monday morning just before sunrise. She had accepted the housekeeping job for one heartbreaking reason: to keep her 82-year-old grandmother in the nursing home that had become the only place she still smiled. Losing this job wasn't an option. Every paycheck meant another month of medicine, another month of dignity, another month of hope. The mansion itself felt strangely beautiful and strangely empty. Its polished marble floors reflected wealth beyond imagination. Yet every hallway seemed haunted by a silence so heavy it felt almost alive. The staff moved carefully, speaking in hushed voices, avoiding eye contact, as though everyone had learned that surviving in this house meant noticing nothing. 4 hours into her very first shift, Claire was ordered onto her knees to scrub a stubborn stain from the freezing marble floor. She lowered herself without complaint. She had swallowed her pride many times before. But then, everything changed. Across the room, hidden beside a tall window where no one seemed willing to look, sat a tiny boy curled into himself. Both hands were clamped over his right ear. His small body rocked gently as his head tapped against the wall over and over again. Not in anger, not in defiance, not because he wanted attention. He was trying to survive a pain no child should ever have to endure. The room ignored him. The servants ignored him. The experts had ignored him for years. But Claire couldn't. In that single heartbreaking moment, she sensed something every medical report had failed to discover. And before this day was over, a secret buried for 7 long years would begin to surface. A truth so devastating that it would change a father's life forever, and give a little boy the voice everyone believed he never had. Stay with this story, because what happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was the kind of miracle that only appears when one ordinary person chooses to truly see another. Claire remained frozen for only a heartbeat. Behind her, the sharp voice of Mrs. Collins sliced through the silence. "Don't touch him." There wasn't anger in her tone. There was routine. The kind of routine that comes from watching the same heartbreaking scene so many times that people stop asking questions. "He does that," Mrs. Collins continued coldly. "The doctors say it's behavioral. Finish cleaning the floor." Behavioral. The word echoed inside Claire's mind. She glanced at the rag lying beside the stain. Then she looked back at the little boy, 7 years old, curled into a corner, tiny shoulders trembling, his hands pressed so tightly against his right ear that the knuckles had turned white. No tears, no screams, only a child who had learned that crying never made the pain stop. Claire knew that look. Years ago, she had seen it on her younger brother's face. Everyone thought he was difficult, attention-seeking, sensitive, until one doctor finally stopped looking at paperwork and started looking at him. That memory hit her chest like a wave. Without another thought, she quietly placed the cloth on the marble floor. Then she walked toward the boy. Every servant in the room stopped moving. No one spoke. No one breathed. It was as though the entire mansion already knew she was making a mistake. Mrs. Collins took one step forward. "I told you not to touch him." But Claire wasn't looking at her anymore. She slowly knelt beside the child, leaving enough space that he wouldn't feel trapped. She didn't reach for him immediately. She simply waited. Sometimes trust begins with silence. The boy didn't look up. His body continued its slow, painful rhythm against the wall. Claire carefully lifted her hands. Instead of pulling his hands away from his ear, she gently placed her own hands over his. Not to force, not to restrain, only to become another layer between his pain and the world. For a single terrifying second, his entire body stiffened, every muscle locked. Claire held perfectly still. She knew fear could feel exactly like resistance. Then, very slowly, his shoulders relaxed. The rhythm stopped. The soft knocking of his head against the wall disappeared. The room fell into a silence so complete that even the ticking grandfather clock across the hall suddenly sounded loud. Claire lowered her eyes and began to hum, barely louder than a whisper. It wasn't a famous song. It wasn't even one she remembered learning. It was the lullaby she had created years earlier while sitting beside her little brother during long nights when neither medicine nor words could comfort him. A melody born from love. Not perfection. Soft. Slow. Steady. Like someone promising, "You're not alone anymore." The little boy's breathing gradually matched the rhythm of the song. His trembling fingers loosened. For the first time since Claire had entered the mansion, his hand slowly slipped away from his ear. Then something happened that no specialist, therapist, or physician had managed to accomplish in 7 long years. He looked at her. Not at her eyes. Not at her hands. At her lips. His gaze remained completely fixed on the gentle movement of every word she hummed, as though he were trying to understand a language everyone else had forgotten to speak. Claire didn't stop singing. She barely dared to breathe. The room seemed suspended in time. Then the little boy lifted one shaking hand. Every servant instinctively leaned forward. No one had ever seen him initiate contact with a stranger. His fingertips slowly reached toward Claire's face. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't interrupt the moment. His tiny fingers rested gently against her lips, feeling the vibration of the melody, feeling the warmth behind every note. Claire kept humming. The fear inside his eyes, the constant expectation that something painful was about to happen, began to melt away. Not completely, not forever, but enough for hope to quietly enter the room. The child reached beside an old cushion and carefully picked up a small paper crane. It had been folded from a brown grocery bag. One wing was crushed. The edges were wrinkled. It wasn't valuable to anyone else. But to him, it was treasure. With both hands, he placed the fragile paper bird into Claire's open palm. No words. No smile. Just a silent gift that carried more trust than most people ever receive in a lifetime. Claire felt tears sting behind her eyes. Somehow, she understood. This wasn't simply a paper crane. It was the first piece of his heart he had ever offered another human being. And although no one in that room realized it yet, that tiny paper bird had just become the beginning of a miracle that would expose a truth hidden for 7 painful years and forever change the lives of everyone inside the Ashford family. The paper crane rested quietly in Claire's trembling hands. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness something impossible. Then reality came crashing back. "What do you think you're doing, Mrs.?" Colin's voice shattered the silence like breaking glass. She strode across the marble floor, her heels echoing through the room. "I warned you," she said, her face hard as stone. "You were told never to touch him." Claire slowly stood, careful not to startle Ethan. "He was hurting himself," she answered softly. "That is not your concern." Her words were cold, sharp, practiced. "As of this moment, your only responsibility is cleaning this house." Claire looked down at the little paper crane still resting in her palm. She wanted to explain what she had seen. The way Ethan had relaxed. The way his breathing had changed. The way he had looked at her lips as though he had been searching for comfort his entire life. But she knew no explanation would matter. "Not here." "Not today." "I understand," she whispered. She picked up the cleaning cloth and returned to the stain on the marble floor. Yet something had already changed. Every few seconds, she could feel a pair of small eyes quietly watching her from across the room. Not with fear, not with suspicion, with hope. It was the kind of hope that frightened her the most. Because hope only hurts when someone takes it away. The following morning, Claire arrived before sunrise as usual. Nothing about the mansion had changed. The same polished floors, the same silent hallways, the same invisible rules. Only Ethan was different. Instead of hiding in the far corner whenever staff members entered the room, he watched the doorway, waiting. When Claire appeared carrying fresh flowers for the sitting room, she noticed him immediately. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, watching, as though making sure she had truly come back. Their eyes met for barely 2 seconds. Then, almost too quickly to notice, he slipped a second folded paper crane onto the windowsill beside her bucket before quietly disappearing down the hallway. Claire felt her chest tighten. No child gives away what they treasure unless they believe they've found someone safe. She carefully picked up the tiny bird and slipped it into the pocket of her apron beside the first one. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Over the next several days, Claire began noticing things no one else seemed willing to notice. Ethan always tilted his head slightly to the left whenever someone spoke. His right ear never seemed to face a voice directly. Whenever dishes clinked together, whenever a door slammed, whenever metal touched glass, his entire body flinched not from surprise, but from pain. It lasted less than a second, so brief that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would miss it completely. But Claire never missed it. She had seen those tiny reactions before. Years ago, in another frightened little boy, her brother, one afternoon, while dusting a bookshelf outside Mr. Ashford's private study, Claire quietly picked up a brass letter opener resting beside a stack of unopened mail. She waited until Ethan settled into his favorite chair near the window. Then, almost imperceptibly, she tapped the metal against the edge of the table. Ting. The reaction was immediate. Ethan's entire right shoulder jerked upward. His hand flew instinctively to the exact same place behind his ear. His eyes squeezed shut. Not because the sound was loud, because it hurt. Claire's heart dropped. No. This wasn't the response of a child who couldn't hear. This was the response of a child who heard far too much before she could think another thought. A calm voice interrupted behind her. "What exactly are you testing?" Claire slowly turned. Standing in the doorway was Jonathan Ashford. The billionaire? Ethan's father. He had witnessed everything. His gaze moved from the letter opener to Ethan, then back to Claire. She lowered the object immediately. "I'm sorry," she said honestly. I wasn't trying to upset him. Then explain. Claire took a slow breath. I think Ethan isn't avoiding sound. Jonathan's expression remained unreadable. I think certain sounds are causing him pain. Silence. I've seen this before. She spoke carefully, choosing every word. My younger brother showed almost identical reactions for nearly 2 years before doctors discovered the real problem. Jonathan folded his arms. My son has been examined by the best specialists in the country. I know. They've treated him since infancy. I understand. They've given me every diagnosis medicine can provide. Claire nodded. And I respect every one of those doctors. She paused. But sometimes, her voice grew quieter. Itas gon handhum, when everyone is searching for something complicated. They stop looking for something simple. Jonathan stared at her for several long seconds. There was no anger in his face, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of a father who had spent years hoping, and years being disappointed. Finally, he spoke. I appreciate your concern, Miss Sullivan. His voice was polite, measured. But I won't allow my son's treatment to be questioned by someone who's been in this house for less than a week. Claire lowered her eyes. I understand. Jonathan turned away. But just before walking back into his office, he looked once more toward Ethan. The little boy had both hands over his ear again. For the briefest moment, something uncertain crossed Jonathan's face. A flicker of doubt. A question he had never allowed himself to ask. It lasted only a second. But sometimes, a single second is all it takes for the truth to begin breaking through years of certainty. That evening, the mansion felt even quieter than usual. Outside, a steady rain tapped softly against the tall windows, wrapping the estate in a lonely kind of silence. Claire continued her work without saying another word about Ethan. She had already crossed a line she wasn't supposed to cross. She knew that. This was a house built on rules, on titles, on knowing your place, and she was only the housekeeper. But every time she walked past Ethan, she noticed the same heart-breaking pattern. Whenever bright afternoon sunlight touched the right side of his face, his shoulders tightened, his breathing changed. Almost without thinking, one small finger would drift to the exact same place behind his right ear. Always the same spot, always the same expression. Pain, not confusion, not fear. Pain. Claire tried to convince herself she was imagining it. She wanted to be wrong. Because if she was right, it meant a little boy had spent years suffering, while the adults around him searched for answers everywhere except the place that mattered. 2 days later, she saw something she could no longer ignore. Ethan wandered into the upstairs hallway just as the afternoon sun streamed through a stained glass window. A single beam of light crossed the right side of his face. Instantly he froze. His eyes squeezed shut. His hand flew to his ear. His knees almost buckled beneath him. It lasted only seconds, but Claire's heart sank. Light. Sound. Always the right ear. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. Her younger brother had reacted the same way years ago before doctors finally discovered what everyone else had overlooked. The memory hit her so powerfully that she couldn't stay silent any longer. She found Jonathan standing alone in the kitchen, staring absently into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. For the first time since she'd arrived at the mansion, he looked less like a billionaire, and more like an exhausted father. Mr. Ashford, Claire said gently. I only need 5 minutes. He looked up. His eyes carried the weariness of someone who hadn't truly rested in years. Go ahead. Claire took a careful breath. I've continued watching Ethan. Jonathan's expression immediately became guarded. She understood why. Every week someone claimed to have a new theory, a new treatment, a new miracle. Most of them wanted money. Others wanted recognition. Claire wanted neither. I believe the pain is always coming from the same place. She continued quietly. The right ear, the same location, triggered by certain sounds and even direct light. Jonathan remained silent. My younger brother lived through something almost identical. She swallowed. For nearly 2 years, doctors treated the wrong condition. She could still remember those nights. Her brother crying until sunrise. Her mother feeling helpless. The endless appointments. The endless bills. The endless words like unlikely, unexplained, behavioral. Until one physician ignored the diagnosis and simply looked. Claire met Jonathan's eyes. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to ask one more question. Request one more examination. A simple inspection inside his ear. If I'm wrong, she forced a small smile. You lose one appointment. But if I'm right, her voice broke. Mo, you could give your son the childhood he's been waiting for. The kitchen fell silent. Jonathan looked at her for a long time. His face revealed nothing. Then, the kitchen door opened. Mrs. Collins walked inside. Her timing was almost too perfect. I apologize for interrupting, she said smoothly, although her eyes never left Claire. But I believe Mr. Ashford should know something. Jonathan turned toward her. Mrs. Collins folded her hands neatly. I've noticed that Miss Sullivan has developed an unusual interest in Master Ethan. She spoke politely, almost kindly, which somehow made every word hurt more. She repeatedly places herself near him. She questions medical decisions. She inserts herself into situations beyond her responsibilities. A brief pause. In my experience, she lowered her voice. People sometimes become very attached to wealthy families for reasons that have nothing to do with kindness. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Claire felt every word strike her heart. Not because they were true, because she knew Jonathan had every reason to believe them. He had spent years protecting his son. Years surrounded by strangers promising hope. Years learning that trust could be expensive. Jonathan slowly looked back at Claire. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired. Painfully tired. Finally, he spoke. I don't need my housekeeper telling me how to care for my son. The words were calm, but they landed harder than shouting ever could. Claire lowered her eyes. She had expected this. Still, it hurt, more than she wanted to admit. Jonathan picked up his coffee. This conversation is over. He walked toward the doorway. Claire couldn't let him leave. Mr. Ashford. He stopped, without turning around. Please. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Just one more look. One more examination. One more chance. One more opportunity to save a little boy who had already lost too many years. For several seconds, Jonathan didn't move. Claire almost believed he might change his mind. Then he quietly answered, No. The single word echoed through the kitchen like a closing door. He walked away. Claire remained standing exactly where she was. She didn't notice the tears gathering in her eyes. She didn't notice Mrs. Collins leaving with the faintest trace of satisfaction. She noticed only one thing. At the end of the hallway, Ethan was standing there. His small hand covered his right ear once again. His frightened eyes weren't looking at his father. They were looking at Claire, as if silently asking the one question no child should ever have to ask. Are you leaving me too? And in that heartbreaking moment, Claire made a promise she never spoke aloud. She would not give up, even if it cost her the job she desperately needed. Even if the entire mansion turned against her. She would not become another adult who chose to look away. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the tiny room above the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling while the rain whispered against the old window. Jonathan's words echoed over and over in her mind. This conversation is over. But Ethan's eyes, those frightened little eyes standing at the end of the hallway, they refused to leave her. She had seen that look once before. Years ago, her younger brother had looked at her exactly the same way from a hospital bed. A child silently begging anyone not to stop believing. Claire had promised herself back then that if she ever recognized that look again, she would never walk away. Not again. Not while there was still hope. The following morning, something immediately felt different. Ethan wasn't downstairs. He never missed breakfast. One of the kitchen maids quietly mentioned he hadn't left his bedroom all morning. "He has another fever," she whispered. "Mrs. Collins says the specialist is coming tomorrow." Tomorrow. Claire's heart tightened. Tomorrow felt too far away. She remembered the color of Ethan's face the day before. The way he winced every time the light struck the right side of his head. The way his breathing grew shallow whenever sharp sounds echoed through the house. This wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. By early afternoon, Mrs. Collins had left the estate for her weekly meeting in the city. For the first time in days, the house felt strangely unguarded. Claire carried fresh towels upstairs, telling herself she was simply doing her job. Nothing more, nothing less. When she reached Ethan's bedroom door, she stopped. The room was unusually quiet. Too quiet. She knocked softly. No answer. She eased the door open. Ethan sat curled against the window seat, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the room. His cheeks were flushed with fever. One hand still covered his right ear. The other rested weakly beside him. He looked exhausted, not like a child after a busy day, like someone who had spent years fighting a battle no one else could see. When he noticed Claire, his tired eyes brightened ever so slightly. He slowly lifted one trembling hand, not to wave, to ask, "Will you stay?" Claire walked over and knelt beside him. She didn't speak. She simply opened her hand, the same quiet gesture she had used before. "May I?" For several long seconds, Ethan looked into her eyes. Then, very slowly, he lowered his hand from his ear. It was permission. It was trust. It was the bravest thing he had ever done. Claire reached into the small medical kit attached to the bedroom wall. Inside was a simple pen light. Nothing expensive. Nothing remarkable. Just a beam of light. She clicked it on. Years ago, she had spent countless evenings learning how to examine her brother's ear under the guidance of a compassionate country physician who had refused to give up on him. She remembered every lesson. Never rush. Never force. Always let the child lead. She gently tilted Ethan's head. The outer canal looked irritated. Red. Swollen. Nothing unusual. She almost convinced herself she had been wrong. Then Ethan shifted slightly. Only a fraction. Barely enough to change the angle. The light caught something. Claire froze. Deep inside the upper wall of the canal, something reflected back. Not skin. Not wax. Something darker. Something smooth. Something that didn't belong. She leaned closer. Her breathing stopped. There it was. A tiny, curved object, barely visible beneath the irritated tissue. No larger than a grain of rice, but unmistakably solid. Her heart began pounding so loudly she feared Ethan might hear it. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. Years of pain. Years of failed treatments. Years of specialists. And somehow, something was still inside his ear, hidden where almost no one would think to look. Claire slowly lowered the pen light. She closed her eyes for one brief moment. Tears burned behind them. Not because she had solved the mystery, because of what the answer meant. A little boy had lived through years of agony, while everyone searched for complicated explanations. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't that the truth is hidden. It's that no one believes it could be simple. She looked back at Ethan. He was watching her carefully, waiting, searching her face for an answer. Claire placed one hand gently against her own heart, then pointed softly toward him. "I see you," she whispered the words. "I know you're hurting." For the first time since she'd met him, tears rolled down Ethan's cheeks. Silent tears. The kind children cry only after they've finally been understood. He reached forward and wrapped his small fingers around Claire's hand. Not tightly, just enough to say, "Don't leave." Claire squeezed his hand back. "I won't." The promise escaped before she realized she'd spoken it aloud. She meant every word, even if it cost her everything. She stood beside the window, looking out over the gray Seattle sky. Her mind raced. She couldn't remove the object herself. Not yet. Not without certainty. Not without help. Jonathan had to know, but he had already refused to listen. Mrs. Collins would never allow another conversation. Every proper path had already been closed. Yet every minute she waited, Ethan continued living with unbearable pain. Claire looked once more at the tiny boy sitting quietly by the window. He wasn't asking for miracles. He wasn't asking for riches. He wasn't asking for the life everyone imagined a billionaire's son must have. He only wanted the pain to stop. And in that heartbreaking realization, Claire made the most difficult decision of her life. Tomorrow, whether anyone believed her or not, she would risk her career, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard to protect. Because some moments in life ask a question that changes everything. Do you protect your future? Or do you protect a child who has no one else left to fight for him? Claire already knew her answer. And that answer was about to set into motion a chain of events that would shake the Ashford family to its very foundation. Claire stood beside the window long after Ethan had fallen asleep. The tiny reflection she had seen inside his ear replayed over and over in her mind. She wished she had never found it, because now she carried a truth she could no longer ignore. And truth sometimes asks more from us than courage alone. It asks for sacrifice. The next morning, Ethan's fever had climbed even higher. His small face had lost what little color it still held. He barely touched his breakfast. Every few minutes, his hand drifted back towards the same place behind his right ear, almost as if his body remembered the pain before his mind did. Claire watched from the kitchen doorway. Every instinct told her that waiting another day was a mistake. Mrs. Collins had already called the pediatric specialist. He wouldn't arrive until the following afternoon. Almost 24 more hours. 24 hours might not matter to most people, but to a child who had already spent 7 years suffering, another day felt unbearably long. Claire made her decision. Late that afternoon, the mansion became unusually quiet. Jonathan had been called into an emergency board meeting downtown. Mrs. Collins had left to oversee preparations for a charity gala. Only a few staff members remained downstairs. Claire climbed the staircase with slow, uncertain steps. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. She wasn't climbing toward Ethan's room. She was climbing toward the moment that would either save him or destroy everything she had left. She knocked softly. Ethan looked toward the door. His tired eyes softened the moment he saw her. No words were needed. Claire walked over and sat beside him. She gently showed him the small pen light again. "Remember," he gave the faintest nod. She held up a second object. A pair of sterile, fine-tipped medical tweezers from the estate's emergency kit. Her hands trembled, not because she doubted what she had seen, because she understood exactly what could happen if she was wrong. She knelt in front of him. "Ethan." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I'm going to try to help. If anything hurts, I stop." He stared into her eyes. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the little boy reached forward and placed his tiny hand over hers. It wasn't fear. It was trust. Complete. Unconditional. The kind of trust only children are capable of giving. Claire felt tears blur her vision. She blinked them away. She couldn't afford shaky hands. Not now. She positioned the light exactly as she had practiced years ago. The tiny object came into view again. Barely visible, almost hidden beneath swollen tissue. She took one slow breath. Then another. The tweezers entered carefully, millimeter by millimeter. Every movement slower than the last. Ethan never looked away from her face. Whenever discomfort crossed his expression, Claire stopped immediately. She smiled softly. "You are so brave," he answered with the smallest nod, as if bravery had never been a choice, only something life had demanded from him. The metal tips touched the object. Claire felt it. Solid. It moved, only slightly. Her heartbeat thundered inside her chest. She adjusted the angle. One final breath. Then, with one smooth, careful motion, the tiny fragment slid free. Claire stared at it in disbelief. A dark, curved piece of hardened medical polymer, no larger than a grain of rice, yet large enough to steal 7 years from a little boy's life. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The room became impossibly still. Ethan blinked. Once, then again. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Slowly, as though someone had quietly opened a window inside a room that had been closed for years. He turned his head toward the bedroom door, then toward the window, then toward the hallway. Listening. Really listening. His eyes widened. Outside, rain had begun falling against the glass. He froze. The sound seemed to surprise him. Not because it hurt. Because it didn't. His lips parted. He lifted both hands away from his ears. For the first time, there was no pain waiting for them. Only sound. Gentle. Beautiful. Alive. A tear slipped down Claire's cheek. She hadn't realized she was crying. Then Ethan looked toward the hallway. Footsteps echoed faintly on the marble floor below. Jonathan had returned home earlier than expected. The sound traveled through the mansion. Ethan followed it instinctively. His eyes filled with wonder. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. He swallowed. Tried again. His voice was weak, rough, fragile from years of silence. But it was there. Dad. Claire stopped breathing. The word barely reached above a whisper, yet it filled the entire room. Ethan looked startled by his own voice, as though he couldn't believe it belonged to him. Then, with growing certainty, he called again. Dad. Louder this time. Clearer. Filled with hope. Downstairs. Footsteps stopped instantly. Silence. Then Jonathan's voice echoed through the hallway. Ethan. A father's heartbeat seemed to fill every corner of the mansion. Seconds later, hurried footsteps thundered up the staircase. The bedroom door burst open. Jonathan stood frozen. His eyes moved rapidly across the room. Ethan. Sitting upright. His cheeks wet with tears. Claire. Still kneeling beside him. The blood-stained tweezers in her hand, and the tiny dark fragment resting beside them. Jonathan didn't know the story. He only saw the ending. His face turned white. What have you done? His voice shook. Claire immediately stood. Please. I can explain. But terror speaks faster than reason. Jonathan crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled Ethan into his arms. He looked at the blood near his son's ear. Then back at Claire. His expression hardened into something she had never seen before. Security. His voice echoed through the hallway. Now. Within moments, 2 guards rushed into the room. Claire didn't resist. She couldn't. She simply looked at Ethan. The little boy reached desperately toward her, his small fingers stretching through the air. No. His voice cracked. The single word was weak, but unmistakably real. Claire! It was the second word he had spoken in 7 years. The guards gently led her toward the door. Jonathan never looked away from his son. Claire understood why. If their places had been reversed, she would have done exactly the same. As the bedroom door slowly closed behind her, Ethan's frightened voice echoed one last time through the hallway. Claire. She closed her eyes. Tears finally escaped. She had just lost the only job keeping her grandmother in a safe nursing home. She had lost her home, her future, perhaps even her freedom. But somewhere behind that closed door, a little boy had just spoken, for the first time in 7 years. And somehow, even through the heartbreak, Claire knew she would make the same choice all over again. The rain had stopped by the time the hospital doors opened again. For the first time in years, the sky above Seattle wasn't hidden behind dark clouds. Thin rays of afternoon sunlight slipped through the glass, warming the corridor where Claire still sat quietly, uncertain whether she belonged there anymore. She wasn't waiting for gratitude. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She was simply waiting to know whether Ethan was finally free from the pain that had stolen so much of his childhood. Moments later, the examination room door slowly opened. Jonathan stepped outside. His suit was still immaculate. His posture was still straight. But the man standing there was no longer the billionaire who believed money could solve every problem. He was simply a father whose heart had just been broken and healed at exactly the same moment. He walked toward Claire without saying a word. When he stopped in front of her, his eyes were red. Not from anger. From regret. I owe you more than an apology, he said quietly. Claire slowly stood. You don't owe me anything. He shook his head. For 7 years. His voice faltered. My son cried in silence. I paid the best specialists. I trusted every report. I believed every diagnosis. And the only person who truly listened to him. He looked directly into her eyes. Mumbortin asekan na forza kortonosenom. Tsunturak was the woman I almost had arrested. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Sometimes silence says what words never can. Finally, Jonathan reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded something worn and fragile. It was the little paper crane Ethan had made years earlier. Claire smiled through tears. He gave me one just like it. Jonathan nodded. I never understood why he kept making them. His eyes drifted toward the hospital room. I think he was waiting for someone he felt safe enough to give one to. Claire looked down at the tiny bird resting between Jonathan's fingers. Its wings were bent. Its edges were creased. It wasn't perfect. Neither were they. Yet somehow, it had survived. Just like hope. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Someone is asking for you. Claire looked up. For me? The nurse smiled. He refuses to stop asking. Claire slowly walked into the room. Ethan was sitting upright on the hospital bed, staring toward the door with wide, hopeful eyes. The moment he saw her, his entire face lit up. Not with surprise, with recognition. The kind that only exists between two people who have carried each other through darkness. He stretched both arms toward her. Claire hurried across the room and knelt beside the bed. Without hesitation, Ethan wrapped his arms tightly around her neck. He held on with every bit of strength his little body had, as though he feared she might disappear if he let go. Claire gently stroked his hair. It's okay. I'm here. You don't have to be brave all by yourself anymore. Ethan slowly pulled back. He looked into her eyes, then toward Jonathan. His lips trembled. For a moment, it seemed as though he was searching for courage. Then, In a voice still soft from years of silence, he whispered, "Dad." Jonathan's eyes instantly filled with tears. He stepped forward. For the very first time, father and son embraced without fear, without confusion, without a wall of silence standing between them. Neither of them noticed they were crying. Neither of them cared. Years of loneliness quietly melted away inside one simple hug. Claire turned her face, giving them the privacy they had waited 7 long years to share. 1 month later, the Ashford estate no longer felt like the mansion Claire had entered on her first day. The marble floors were still polished. The grand staircase still reached toward towering ceilings. But something had changed. The silence was gone. Every morning, laughter drifted through the halls. Music played softly in the kitchen. Jonathan no longer spent every meal alone behind the closed doors of his office. Dinner was shared around the long dining table. Not because tradition demanded it, because Ethan asked for it. He loved hearing the little sounds most people never notice. The clinking of forks, the bubbling of soup, the rain tapping against the windows, Claire laughing when he proudly read another sentence from his favorite storybook. Each sound reminded him of everything he had almost lost. One evening, after dinner, Ethan quietly walked toward the windowsill. There, beside the glass, rested the first paper crane he had ever given Claire. He carefully picked it up, then placed it into his father's hand. Jonathan smiled. "What should we do with it?" Ethan looked toward Claire, then back at his father. His smile grew a little brighter. "Let it stay." Jonathan placed the little crane in the center of the room, where everyone could see it. Not as a reminder of 7 painful years, but as proof that even the most broken things can become symbols of hope. Claire stood quietly beside the window, watching father and son laugh together. At that moment, she realized something beautiful. She had never come to the Ashford estate to change anyone's life. She had only come looking for a paycheck. Instead, she found a family, and a little boy who had finally discovered that the world wasn't a place to fear anymore. It was a place worth listening to. There are moments in life that remind us not every wound can be seen. Some people carry their pain so quietly that the world mistakes their silence for acceptance. Ethan didn't need another expensive treatment. He didn't need another expert to tell him who he was. He needed just one person willing to slow down, to look beyond the diagnosis, and to believe that his silence was trying to say something. Claire never imagined she would change anyone's life. She simply refused to walk past a child who was hurting. In a world where so many people are busy proving they're right, she chose something far more powerful. She chose to care. Maybe that's the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. Never underestimate the difference one compassionate heart can make. You don't have to be rich to change someone's future. You don't need a title to make someone feel seen. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, a gentle voice, a patient ear, a hand reaching out when everyone else walks away, can become the reason another person finds hope again. Perhaps, somewhere in your own life, there's someone quietly carrying a burden no one else has noticed. A child, a parent, a friend, a neighbor. Before you walk away today, take one more look. Ask one more question. Listen just a little longer. Because the person waiting for someone to understand them may be closer than you think. And sometimes, one moment of compassion can change a life forever. Before you go, if this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Please like this video, because every like helps this story reach someone who may need hope today. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us kindness still exists in this world. And now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been the person no one believed? Or has someone ever changed your life simply because they chose to truly see you? Share your experience in the comments. You never know whose heart your story might heal. And if you believe the world needs a little more compassion, please share this video with someone you love. Because sometimes, the story that changes someone else's life begins with one simple click.